Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. Today, I have one of my best friends, Bryan Montany, on the program. We're going to talk about atheism versus Christianity. We're going to talk about the arguments you normally hear from the atheist side and the arguments you normally hear from the Christian side. Bryan is a dear friend from undergrad, and we met when we were in college. We lived on the same floor, and we met when I needed help with a midterm. I was struggling, and Bryan was the only one who got an A in that class. So I remember knocking on Bryan's door, and then the friendship began, right? Is that how it all began?
I remember you knocking on my door late at night one night. We had crossed paths a few
Yeah, I know.
times before then because we lived on the same floor. We probably shared an elevator ride down. But yeah, that was the first time that night when you asked to borrow my notes for a U.S. politics course that you and I were both in. And I guess a beautiful friendship began from there. But at that moment, I just remember thinking to myself, who is this guy and what is he doing at midnight knocking on my door asking for class notes?
Yeah, totally. You totally helped me get a better grade. I needed the good grades for a scholarship. I remember I was like, oh no, this is destroying my GPA. And um, so yeah, and then when we met, you were an atheist, correct?
Oh, I'd say not only an atheist, but one of those diehard atheists that you hear about from time to time who was a little more militant about it. Not in the sense that I was starting any wars, but certainly in the sense that I was very eager to debate and confront Christians and other believers of faith, any faith really, and just argue incessantly with them. People like Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan were huge inspirations for me in that moment in my life. And I'm still actually a fan of Sagan today in some of his works anyway. Um, but I definitely was the type of atheist who deep down had a hole in my life due to a lack of faith that was just not being filled or properly addressed. And so I would constantly act out, in part because I was secretly, privately desperate for a different answer than the one I had concluded. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
that was basically my background.
So unpack that a bit because I think it's really important, especially for like those who are listening. Most likely you're Christian, and sometimes I feel like the church doesn't get the fact that like if you believe in an afterlife or there's a future or a purpose behind anything, you're talking to someone who reaches a different conclusion. I think it's always weird when the Christians get like prideful or hostile towards atheists, or like I think it's I like. So can you unpack what you were saying about like this hole in your heart, or like you're just upset with the conclusion you arrived to?
It's my personal belief, and I don't have any statistics to back this up. This is just anecdotal based on my experience. But it's my personal belief that the more outspoken an atheist that you run into on a day-to-day basis, the more likely they are a believer in hiding or someone who certainly needs a proper nudge, but is asking the right questions at least and is almost begging to be brought to a different conclusion. I think the hardest to reach atheists or agnostics are the ones who are comfortable engaging in casual conversation, are not really as engaged at all in the topics, don't really have an argument to back their feelings, and just ultimately say, yeah, I just, in the end, I don't believe in God. And that's the end of the discussion. But if you engage with an atheist and they're virulent in their beliefs, they come after you, and they constantly bring up different talking points. They have clearly done their research. In the end, part of the reason that they've done that research in the first place is because, if they're anything like me anyway, they have been asking those types of questions and are eager to discover a deeper meaning in their life, but ultimately, for whatever reason, cannot reach the conclusion in favor of the existence of God. But they're really active and hostile and committed to those arguments, I think in part because they almost want to be proven wrong. Maybe want to be proven wrong is the wrong way to put it. Certainly someone like Richard Dawkins would disagree. But there is something, I think, that drives a certain type of person to spend hours or days researching these topics from the perspective of trying to prove that God doesn't exist. And I think ultimately the reason to want to prove that he doesn't exist is very similar to the drive that many Christians and other believers in God or another deity feel that drives them to prove that God does exist, right?
Right, right. So you're saying that like that desire to just seek answers is different. You're dealing with a different type of person versus someone who's just like a casual, I'm spiritual and not religious malaise of like this new category of the nuns, NONS, how more people are not identifying with religion. You're saying that like those who are more militant about it or more aggressive about it are um, on a path because they're looking for an answer at least. They're not indifferent.
Absolutely. In my case specifically, one of the major drivers that led me to become more militant or more aggressive shortly before I met you was that I had gone through a pretty serious depression in my sophomore year of college. I nearly failed out of college during a semester where I really underperformed, was not attending classes. It was a combination of a number of factors relating to the failed relationship drama that we all go through to some extent in college. Just the fact that in retrospect, I was ill-equipped for experiencing some of the things that I ran into once I was living on my own and not in that comfortable environment with my family. Um, just a lot of factors like that and a lot of question marks in my life. I wanted to study abroad and ultimately found out my sophomore year that I was not going to be able to study abroad due to an inability to meet certain requirements. Um, it just sort of destroyed my plans and didn't really have any backup plans. And so, yeah, I was in a moment in my life, kind of a crossroads, where I was asking those deep questions because I was trying to fill that hole of emptiness that stemmed from a serious depression, losing out on some opportunities in life, not really having a direction in life, being in a moment where I really didn't have much to do, to be honest, aside from my academics. I didn't really have a vision for my future. So I invested a lot of time that semester because I found myself that year actually living on a floor that was dominated by Christians.
Yeah, it was like the only floor on campus that was like Christian. Yeah.
um, I just really felt compelled to do a lot of research initially because I wanted to disprove the existence of God. I wanted to feel the satisfaction of defeating people like you and some others on that floor in debates and arguments, but really just feel justified in this belief, this ultimately unsatisfactory belief that that there was nothing after death, that there was no afterlife, that no one ultimately cared about you on that higher plane of existence, and that there was nothing more than just these kind of squabbles, this kind of pointless existence on this planet. um, I mean, that's melodramatic, but it really was kind of a view into my mind at the time. I was a little melodramatic back then.
So, what are some of the like uh uh objective lines of reason that you kind of hear from the Dawkins, the Sagans, the Hitchens, there's a group of militant atheists. It's like a subcategory of certain individuals. What's the line of thinking that they reach the conclusion? Like, what's the logic behind it? What's their main arguments usually?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this one, relates to the problem of evil. And the atheistic perspective is that Christians and other faiths, other religions generally, don't have an adequate answer to address the problem of evil.
So, what is the problem of evil?
My bare bones understanding of it is essentially um, Christianity and other religions basically simultaneously posit that the existence of God that God is omnipotent, meaning, from an almost scientific perspective, he is above us, extra dimensional, beyond the constraints of space and time. He is capable of making miracles happen. He is capable of um, making basically anything happen. He can create life. Um, so from that perspective, he is all powerful. He is also benevolent, right? Certainly the Christian perspective on God is that he is the supremely benevolent being, that he ultimately cares for every human being on this planet, that he loves us all deeply and dearly, that he ultimately wants what's best for us. Um, and so the atheistic perspective would counter those claims from Christians and point out, how do you address the existence of evil in this world if God is, this benevolent, powerful being who could metaphorically snap his fingers at any given moment and take us out of any crisis, or eliminate the existence of pain, prevent people we love from dying, prevent war, prevent chaos, prevent harms from being inflicted. Um, and Yeah, on its face, right, that is a compelling argument because it appeals to emotions as well as logic.
Mm-hmm.
Most apologetics, even other forms of apologetics we may get into later, don't really t- touch upon the emotional side as well as the logical side. Um, Most apologetics are kind of strictly in the realm of, arguing whether Jesus really did something historically, whether he really lived historically, whether certain biblical passages are true, whether certain prophecies came to pass. With the problem of evil, you're simultaneously making a logical argument, but also addressing a deep emotional void in all of us, which is we've all experienced profound hurt in our lives, um, for different reasons to varying degrees. But this world is imperfect and flawed. We've all been through some really terrible circumstances. And, the atheist, when the atheist points out, this contradicts the idea of a benevolent God who can make all this pain go away, that's really appealing, especially when we're going through hard times.
Great. Yeah. So like normally, like if you go to like a atheist versus Christian debate, you have the atheists doing the problem of evil, which is something theologians have wrestled with since Augustine, Pascal, you name it, like in the church.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have like the Christians doing the biblical defense, and it's just like, yeah, I don't care if the Bible is accurate or trustworthy right now. I'm just more angry about the bigger problem of evil.
Yeah.
And normally it's like, all right, the atheist gets up and does the problem of evil talk, and then like the Christian apologetic guy does usually like the fine tuning argument or the cosmological argument, where it's like everything is so perfect in the world that it can't be random. God is in control. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like the fine tuning argument, like the other perspective of.
Yeah, well, the fine tuning argument, the reason why I ultimately think that it does not adequately address the problem of evil on its own merits is, in the end, the fine tuning argument is really strictly in the realm of logic. It doesn't really address the problem of evil, which in the end is really coming at it from the perspective of morality, good versus evil. Why is the world the way it is? Why are people the way they are? The fine tuning argument essentially boils down to, if my understanding is correct, this idea that conditions on Earth were unique to propagate life, to propagate intelligent life, that it could only happen here, it couldn't possibly happen anywhere else. And the odds of it happening are so astronomically low that it points to the existence of God, that it even happened at all. It's, it's a fine argument on its merits, but when someone is coming to you and asking questions relating to the problem of evil and the problem of, ethics and the idea of why are we suffering and why is there suffering in the world? Why do even animals and children suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? And you respond with something like that. It's like two different languages. It
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
flies over their head.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. Like one side is like acknowledging all the chaos and evil in the world, and the other side is trying to promote all the order and structure of the world, while the truth is probably somewhere in between the order and the chaos. Um, so okay, so you were an atheist. What began to make the turn to Christianity? Like what was going on to like how would you address that problem of evil for you? No
That's a
pressure.
complicated question.
No pressure.
Um, I think the mistake that many Christians make, or the assumption that many Christians make that is inaccurate, is that um, the problem of evil can be fully addressed before a Christian conversion really happens. I don't think I had an adequate answer to the question of the problem of evil before I became a Christian. And the moment I became a Christian, everything changed, my worldview changed. And in the end, it's really the existence of the afterlife, of life after death, in and of itself, that answers the question of the problem of evil. If you are an atheist, then the assumption that you make as an atheist in general is that when you die, that is the end of your story. That is the end of your life. There is nothing after the end of your life. And so there really is no adequate answer to the problem of evil if you assume that the narrative cuts off there. It's like if you're reading a book, a traditional book with a beginning, a middle, of the end, and you're in the middle of the book, the tensions are high, the heroes face their ultimate crisis, nothing has been resolved, and you just shut the book halfway and you ask a person who's reading that book, are you satisfied with the ending? Of course, they're not going to be satisfied because the book has not anywhere near ended. The conflicts have not been resolved. The villain is probably winning, and the heroes are experiencing tremendous pain. It's the same thing with the problem of evil in the course of our 80, 100, however long we live on this planet lives. We're not going to get satisfactory answers in this world. The moment you believe in an afterlife, the question of the problem of evil just takes on an entirely different dimension, because all of a sudden it's not an 80 or 100-year narrative that our lives are. It's thousands of years. It's an eternity. It's the scope is just so dramatically different. So from that perspective, I'm not really sure that the problem of evil can be adequately addressed through apologetics. We can provide some answers, but the answers often require the presupposition that you believe in God in order for the answers to work.
Right, right.
Um, so from that perspective, you can almost address the problem of evil by saying, well, if you are a Christian, you believe X, Y, and Z about life after death, about a relationship with God that perseveres even after you die, about, you know, free will in the context of this world, but it's not the end of your story, even if you do suffer tremendously in this world. Um, but that's really the extent of it. There is no answer to the problem of evil that will sound satisfactory on its face to an atheist.
Right, right. So what led you to Christianity exactly? What were some of the other arguments, not necessarily in the context of problem of evil, but what drew you to Christ?
I feel like my story is unique and not necessarily generally applicable,
Of course.
because if we reference my story, um, I am kind of an amateur dabbling historian. As you know, I am really interested in history and talk about it and think about it often.
And I love the fact that you know more about Armenian history than most Armenians, and including me, who loves Armenian history as well. Maybe we could talk about the city of Ani next time you're on.
Sure, I'd love to. Um, but yeah, I feel like part of the beauty of our own experiences in coming to Christianity is that it's unique and individualized. When I talk to different atheists who have come to Christianity, I feel like the answers are all a little personalized. And I think that's part of the beauty of our own personal relationships with God, that God speaks our language to us. The Holy Spirit moves in profoundly different ways. You can't really bottle it up into a single simplistic answer as to, like, as a Christian, for example, this is how you minister to every atheist. That's simultaneously a phenomenal thing in terms of our individuality as people. It's also a challenge in terms of our ministry and our work as Christians. But for me personally, as that amateur historian, the historical arguments relating to proof in regards to especially the New Testament, but even to some extent the Old Testament, that certain events really did happen, that Jesus Christ really did live, that certain events were documented within a generation or two after his death, that it would be extremely difficult to falsify the narratives within the time span of 20, 50, even 100 years, when people or the children of people who would have been, directly involved in these stories would have still been alive. Even the historical arguments surrounding the veracity and the authenticity, the sheer volume, in fact, of the narrative of Jesus's life. On the one hand, you'll hear atheists bring up, for example, oh, this evidence only came out 50, 100 years, several generations after Jesus's death, all these gospels, all of these proofs. But the reality of the matter is, you look at any other historical figure from that time period, and Jesus really starts to stick out because, you compare it to something like um, the Odyssey, even Julius Caesar's life, even the lives of other, mythological, historical people back then. And the evidence for Jesus really starts to sound a lot stronger when you compare and contrast how quickly those narratives were written. And it just strikes you that, okay, something really happened back in the first century AD that must have been incredibly profound, because there are all these different writers documenting this story, whereas, meanwhile, Julius Caesar is um, living his life around that time period shortly beforehand. And the evidence is equally or perhaps even more sparse in some respects in regards to certain aspects of his life and other secular figures in that time frame. So those are the arguments that I gravitated to personally, given my background, given my interest as that amateur historian. Even evidence regarding the Old Testament and the lives of people like David, and experiences like Exodus. As I
So
started, yeah.
keep going, keep going.
Well, just as I started to, receive exposure to evidence that contradicted my assumptions, it really kind of pulled at me and led me down this rabbit hole of reading and researching more and more.
Yeah. So I love you because like you have this analytical mind, but you also have the because you went to like Georgetown Law. You're a deep thinker. It has to make logical sense, but it can't just make logical sense. As you're saying, like the main thing is, does the story add up or line up?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think we can move on from there.
Great. Great. So, and then what led to the point of conversion? Like just you could buy the testaments, the New Testament specifically, you could buy into the story, and then what?
So I've talked a bit about my historical kind of research on the side. But as this was all happening, the catalyst really began when I started attending a Bible study. You and others were involved in that Bible study on our floor at American University in our dorm. And we were going through the Gospel of John. Um, I don't know if you recall this, but it was, we must have been around like the 8th or 9th chapter. We were going through it like chapter by chapter, week by week. Um, and it started gnawing at me. If you remember the first few times that I attended that Bible study, I was really belligerent and really confrontational about it, and not necessarily impolite, but certainly asking awkward or uncomfortable questions and trying to be challenging. But as we were reading through the Gospel of John, some of the passages were really impacting me, leading me to do that research and become more and more questioning and conflicting in my own beliefs. But all that's to say, all of this is going on over the course of several months. It was not necessarily an instantaneous decision. But I do remember March 5th, 2005, being the day of my conversion, being the day where I had a profound experience with the Holy Spirit. And that was a uniquely emotional experience, nothing really to do with everything apologetics. I think all the apologetics, all of the research that I was doing, all of the questions I was asking, reading at the time Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith, were two books that had a profound influence on me back then. In answering those questions, it kind of set the groundwork. It put me in a position where I was asking the right questions and doing the right reflection and contemplation, and occasionally finding myself reaching out to God. But really, it was a moment late at night on March 5th where I am kneeling at my bedside. I've probably had one too many to drink uh, after a night where I've acted out a little in a way that I should not have, as many of us in college at the time would. Um, and I'm just, profoundly distraught in terms of those bigger questions about the meaning of my life and seeking purpose and seeking values and an identity that were eluding me. Um, and I'm just kneeling there, and perhaps because I've been around people who in my life who have been praying, I just sort of enter this state of prayer almost kind of non-voluntarily, or just sort of as an impulse as opposed to a conscious decision. I just sort of slip into prayer, and then I feel, the only way I can describe it, it's like a tidal wave of the Holy Spirit just slamming into me, and just this like revelatory moment of, oh, I'm actually interacting with someone, that someone being God through the Holy Spirit. And this is actually like a conversation, like a relationship. You have the moments of the goosebumps, the tingles down your spine when you're just realizing it's not just me in this moment. Um, and that was my conversion moment. I guess I go into detail there just to say apologetics are fun, right? It's fun to talk about, it's fun to debate. They can set the stage. I do believe in their importance as a rhetorical device for Christians to have a defense, so that when atheists ask questions, you have some answers that your faith does not come across as totally unfounded. I think that's important. But at the end of the day, when it comes to something as personal as that moment of giving yourself to God, it really has to be something beyond the realm of apologetics. It has to be driven by the Holy Spirit. It has to be relational and between you and God, and not something that any amount of apologetics can really adequately explain or address.
Because apologetics is like, I'm trying to, like, the atheist is trying to disprove God. The apologetic guy is trying to prove God. What both people do is they end up turning God into an idea or theory that you're trying to prove or disprove. And
Right.
you're talking about an encounter with the Trinity right now.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's really tragic, not fascinating. This is a tragic story. Like, the world's one of the best known Christian apologetics, Ravi Zacharias, who died a year ago, was caught in a lot of sexual scandal and sin.
Right.
And ironically, an atheist was trying to wake up the people to his crimes. He had a website trying to put him on blast, but the Christian church wasn't listening to the atheist who was acting like the Christian witness. And it's like such a twisted story where you have an atheist calling out the Christian apologetics on morality, and no one batting an eye because they assume that the Christian apologetics, who's so well versed and articulate and helped many people come to faith, um, is living this hidden life. And his whole reputation is ruined. If I listen to an apologetics clip from him right now on the YouTube, I can't take it seriously knowing his secrets. Of course, everyone is not perfect, but this is really dark stuff that he let linger. And it's interesting just the way you're viewing apologetics versus just a cookie cutter. Let me prove the stupid Christians wrong, or let me prove the stupid atheist wrong. And I think that's just unbiblical, first of all, and could do the opposite impact of showing someone the love of God.
Yeah, I do think that we have to separate apologetic arguments from their authors, from the perspective that I don't like all of Ravi Zacharias' arguments. A few of his arguments are, just reading the arguments on their face, they fell flat for me even before these revelations really came to light. But a few of his arguments also were intriguing and impactful and positive to me. And the problem that we constantly run into as Christians is, unfortunately, the nature of sin in this world. The people that we look up to, whether they be pastors, other Christians in positions of authority, mentor figures, often, unfortunately, let us down, and we uncover terrible things about them. We learn terrible secrets. All that's to say, I mean, it is unfortunate that it does impact our ability to take some of those arguments seriously, because we know in the back of our minds that the man who wrote these arguments, who advocated these arguments, engaged in terrible sin. But in the end, I do think it is a distinction that we have to try to find, because some arguments are objectively good, strong, powerful arguments who nonetheless are made by terrible men. And I think part of the problem for me as both an atheist and a Christian is, back when I was an atheist, I idolized especially Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, a personal hero of mine, back to the days where I was very young and very interested in astronomy, and used to really love studying outer space in middle school. I also had a great teacher back then who was like a mentor to me in that moment in my life, who really drove that interest. I still, to this day, find many of Carl Sagan's arguments and a lot of his personality beautiful, even though, he would argue against the existence of God, not necessarily from the most, I don't think he was as hostile or adversarial as someone like Dawkins, but certainly, definitely was not in his wheelhouse to advocate for faith. And he would probably discourage people from believing in the Christian God and taking Christian arguments seriously. But, there are atheists who I idolized back in my days as an atheist. And when I first became a Christian, there were Christians who I idolized shortly after my conversion experience and after I became a Christian. It would, fortunately, I have not heard anything nearly as terrible as someone like C.S. Lewis. But can you imagine how awful it would be if we heard something that would change our perception of someone who has been influential in our walks with God as C.S. Lewis? I think in the end, the challenge that we're going to have to continue to struggle with is separating objectively good and positive and right beliefs from the sins of those who promulgate those beliefs. And it is such a challenge. I'm just reminded by, I think there's biblical narratives, and certainly also Christians have reflected on the fact that hypocrisy from Christians and sins committed by Christians in power can be so much more detrimental to the faith and can have so much a greater impact on communities of faith than the sins committed by atheists or just sins committed by people who we just know to be objectively bad. When people in a position of power and authority in the church commit a sin, it's not only the sin itself that is so dangerous and damaging, it's also the questions that we then ask about objectively good theology or objectively good apologetics or objectively good Christian tenets, because the person promulgating those tenets or advocating those beliefs has been outed as a hypocrite and as someone who did not live, by what he was preaching.
Yeah, that's good. Any closing things you would like to say before we wrap this up?
I think the most important thing you can do when ministering to someone has almost nothing to do with apologetics, nothing to do with the arguments that you're advocating. You don't need to spend hours upon hours reading C.S. Lewis, Lee Strobel, Josh McDowell, your favorite apologetics author, to prepare yourself for any interaction with an atheist. What you really need to do, and perhaps the hardest thing to do, is listen. And I mean, I'm just as guilty myself. Sometimes it's a real struggle because I certainly want to, in moments when I listen to an atheist today, just want to sort of cut them off when I hear them talking about their struggles or talking about the problem of evil or talking about some other question that they're hung up with. I just want to say, oh, I was like you once. I have the answers that you're seeking. Here's some great arguments, X, Y, and Z. Here's what C.S. Lewis had to say about this in his great work, Mere Christianity, X, Y, Z, bring the arguments to all these kind of butt heads on certain points and try to articulate the exact process that I went through. But it's always unique to the individual, and often questions that seem to demand apologetic answers really, at the end of the day, are questions that atheists advocate when they really just want you to listen to their life story. They're not actually as interested in having a debate over whether Jesus Christ really lived or why a benevolent God would allow some abstract evil or some large-scale evil in history to have occurred. What they're really asking of you, even if they're not articulating it perfectly in the moment, is to listen to their life story, to hear out what they've gone through individually as a person, and just relate and empathize with their struggles, because often it is those struggles that are barriers to their faith, that are barriers to them accepting the idea of the existence of God.
Well put. Well put. That sums it up. Evangelism has more to do with listening than speaking. Or the Armenian proverb, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to listen twice as much as you speak. And the scriptures say, be slow to speak, quick to listen. There's something about how hard it is just to be empathetic and just listen to the person in front of you. And if everyone did that, this world would be a much better place. Bryan, this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for your input. And it's just good to see you, my friend. Thanks for all those who are watching. Stay caffeinated and see you next week.